Okay, welcome everybody. And we're happy to have you all back to another webinar, this time with Luigi Zingales from Chicago booth. Hi, Luigi.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks to, it's great to have you. Luigi will talk about which capitalism, quick question mark. And before I go into this question with Luigi, let me do some housekeeping and some advertising what we did so far. So far last week, Esteban Rossi-Hansberg was talking about the economic geography of climate change. And next week, Chris Sims will talk how to worry about government debt. And then Bengt Holmström will talk about seasonal COVID. And later in the term, Esther Duflo will come. But Luigi today will talk about which capitalism. And capitalism, you know, when we go through a crisis, is typically always a hot topic. So what I did here is I just plotted how often Google Ngrams actually people search for the word capitalism or how often it appears in books. And what you can see here, you can see that, you know, when in the 1930s, it was after 29, the stock market crash, it was going up a lot, and then it came down again. The term capitalism was very, very high search intensity. You also see that there's a flat region over there in the early 2000s. So the Nasdaq bubble or something did not cause a lot of additional activity in capitalism, but then it subsequently, it went up significantly. So there's a lot of interest in this topic, and we're looking forward what Luigi has to tell us today on this topic. And of course, he is heading the Stigler Center at Chicago booth, and he is really dedicating a lot of his research to this question. So before I start, I would like to mention two recent books which came out on this topic. One is called The Cold Heart, or The Heart of Stone. It's a German book, and it's based, it draws on the German fairy tale from Wilhelm Hauff from 1827, which the German communists have used a lot to badmouth capitalism. But Werner Blumpe turns it around and says, okay, capitalism actually is not so easy to define because it's constant in flux. It's the plasticity of capitalism, and the dynamism is very, very important to understand. And that's also why it brought billions of people into a higher wealth and a higher situation they are sitting now. Now here, I think what's important is that the profit motive is very, very important. And then, you know, you have competition. The competition itself leads to dynamic competition, leads to R&D investment, which causes some externalities and follow-up R&D investments. So there's some cycle here. But what's important is that most of these R&D investments have huge economies of scale. Just think of Henry Ford and others. You know, it's all about economies of scale, and that led to huge mass production. So capitalism led to a lot of mass production rather than tailored individual production. Mass production was the key, and you also see it in the current revolutionary IT revolution. It's all about huge quantities, low marginal cost, and it only works if you also have mass purchasing power. So you need a consumption by the masses as well, and that you can achieve if real wages go up. So you can't have too much income inequality. If income inequality goes down, it helps to have more purchasing power. That helps again the profit motive, and then leads to more innovation and more investment in R&D and so forth. And the purchasing power can come for two reasons. One is real wages are going up. That's one way. Another one is you ease access to debt and credit for the general citizens. And that's one way to see that. So that's one channel, but important is this dynamism where constantly generate new investments. The new investments lead to productivity gains, and the productivity gains ultimately help the society to live in a more healthy and a wealthy environment. And actually, when you read Keynes' 1990, so of Peace of War, essentially the consequences of peace of war, he was actually arguing, which is very, very interesting, that wealth inequality is actually was justifiable before the First World War because it led to a lot of investments. So because if there's a lot of wealth inequality, but it leads to a lot of investment, which leads to the spillovers in R&D and spillovers to others, then it's actually justifiable. And that's one key part. That's the argument in this book, is one key part why capitalism was so successful going forward. So that's one book which I just would like to mention. And then there's another one which just came out recently by my colleague Charles Bosch, who actually is a political scientist, and looks much more democratic capitalism and saying how is capitalism connected to democracy. And he goes through 3 defining stages of capitalism. One is the Manchester capitalism in the 19th century, then the early Detroit, Henry Ford, and so forth. And then the Silicon Valley, now what we are sitting in now, Steve Jobs type of environment. And he argues, actually this inequality might be a problem because you have some more polarization going on, skill premium for high quality, very qualified workers is going up. And that might actually hurt this dynamism we're seeing up there. But we will see many more things today from Luigi, probably more focused, not about this big capitalism cycle here, the dynamism, but the question is always how to limit the power, the concentration of power. And for that, I think markets are very important and competition is very important. So having competition in a clear mandate that the people can actually exit, using Albert Hirschman's terms, in the goods market, they can go to some competitor. In the funding market, they can withdraw the funding and go to some other things. So we will talk later about ESG investing. What's the role of ESG investing? That's an important topic too. We would like to cover in some future webinar as well. And then there's another way to limit the concentration of power is through voice. It's through elections, for example. You can vote in shareholder votes, or you can also vote in democratic perspective. That's coming back to the second book I mentioned before. The main focus for Luigi, I think, is today more on the stakeholder governance or the shareholder governance moving to a stakeholder governance. And that's really hotly debated at the moment. I think that's probably one of the hottest issues in the moment, besides COVID and other environmental issues. And the Business Roundtable has essentially put forward a corporate purpose which shifts away from shareholder focus to a more broader stakeholder focus with employees, suppliers, and demanders, customers in the community, and so forth. It's also the 50-year anniversary of Milton Friedman's big article on shareholder governance. And I think Luigi will allude to that because his center has actually dedicated a whole sequence on this topic. Then, of course, we have already non-profit organizations which are not profit-driven, and they're much more driven by other motives. And then the question is, what are the problems which comes with that? So if you move away from shareholder focus, shareholder wealth maximization, towards a more general objective, then it, of course, gives power to the CEOs and they can push their pet projects, and we have to see how this goes. More generally, going back a little bit, of course, I remember when I lived in the UK and London, the third way was bigly debated. Stakeholder society was a big issue at that time. In Germany, we have in our constitution, so the German constitution says that ownership comes with responsibilities. That's one of the guiding principles. And you see also many elements in the law where this co-determination goes on. So whenever there is a board, there's half of the board, the employees have representation on the boards. And you have a lot of companies which are owned by foundations. And there's now a new initiative going on that even small companies should have some new legal form where there's more responsible ownership. So overall, across the globe, not only in the US, through the Business Roundtable, also in Europe, there's a big debate going on. How should we design the stakeholder governance? And we're hoping to learn something more from Luigi's thinking. And he has written a paper about this recently with Oliver Hart and a third co-author, and he will outline his thoughts in a few minutes. So we start, as always, with some poll questions, and thanks for answering them. The first question was, from a social efficiency perspective, is it optimal that Google focuses only on maximizing long-term stock prices? And only 21% or something, 25% said yes, but 75% said no. The second question was, is the firm just a nexus of contracts? That's, if you go to contract theory, the theory of the firm, that's one view. And actually 22% only say yes, 78% said no. And should we impose limits on corporate lobbying? And actually there is an overwhelming majority which said 88% said actually we should limit it, and only 12% that we should not limit it. And with that, I leave the floor to Luigi or the screen, and he will give us his perspective and whether, you know, our poll questions came out right to his liking or not, and how to analyze this and how to put everything in an analytical framework. Thanks again, Luigi. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Markus, for the kind introduction and the interesting poll. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so I think that you know, the only problem is that the screen does not. Let me see. Okay, so since the beginning of the 20th century, most economic activity, first in the United States, then in the rest of the world, started to take place in the corporate form. So when you think about our standard microeconomic textbook, we assume that corporations maximize profit. Now, as it happens, this is not true from a positive point of view, and it's not necessarily true from a normative perspective, but that's where most of our economics, at least basic microeconomics, is done. Now, not surprisingly, with the diffusion of the importance of the corporate form, at least since the 1930s, economists, legal scholars, and management gurus have been struggling with the question of what corporations should do, what they should maximize, if they should maximize anything. And what I claim is this answer is really fundamental in shaping the society we live in, the type of capitalist system we live in, and so on and so forth. Now, as a historical setting, in the first 25 years after World War II, corporate boards were thought to be guardians of all interest, which the corporation affects, and not merely servants of its absentee owners. This is a quote from an article of Maureen Dodd that wrote in Merrick Dodd, sorry, that wrote in 1932 in the Harvard Law Review. And you can think about this as the standard of practice when the 1970 article by Friedman appeared in the New York Times. Friedman wrote that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profit. In fact, at some point say this only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And this article has been incredibly influential, has been derided, has been criticized, has been loved. Some people claim that even the Wall Street movie in the 80s, where Gordon Gekko, interpreted by a young Michael Douglas, say that greed is good, is derived from that piece. That piece recently being accused to be the world's dumbest idea. But whether you love it or hate it, Milton Friedman piece in the New York Times has really shaped the conversation and, most importantly, shaped capitalism for the last 50 years. I think this must be one of the most consequential op-eds written in the 20th century, maybe ever written. And the fundamental question that we're asking today, 50 years later, is to what extent these ideas are valid, to what extent are not, and what does it mean for the type of capitalism we live today and the type of capitalism we want to live in. To this extent, as Markus mentioned, the pro-market publication, which is a publication of the Stiegler Center, has opened a debate that has seen various opinions. And so I will draw heavily from this debate in trying to see sort of 50 years later, what can we say about what corporate board should be? And so one of the contributors to this debate, Alex Edmonds, said that we can think about Friedman's statement as basically a different version of some kind of Modigliani-Miller theorem, where what matters is not whether the theorem is right or not. Of course, given the assumption the theorem is right, the question is, what are those assumptions and how credible they are, how big the violation. And so Friedman's idea is that the only focus of managers is to maximize profits, leads to really what I would like to call a separation theorem. We all learn and study what is called the Fisher separation theorem, that when you have to invest at the corporate level, you don't have to care about the preferences of all your shareholders in terms of consuming tomorrow or today. You just look at the interest rate, and that's enough to determine what you do. And in a sense, the Friedman theorem is very similar in the same spirit, because you say, I don't need to know what each individual shareholder wants. What I'm going to do as a manager, I maximize profits, and then I distribute the money, and the shareholders will decide with that money what to do. And I want to stress, because not everybody appreciates that, how important this principle is also in the world of foundations and asset management. Princeton is one of the richest universities in America. They have a huge endowment. They run this endowment to maximize financial returns. Now, the university might have its goal, for example, education, but they don't let that goal interfere the way assets are managed. And this is not unique to Princeton. It's true for Chicago, it's true for Harvard, it's true for foundations. So I can be the Gates Foundation, and on the one hand, I distribute money to eradicate poverty in Africa. On the other hand, I invest in companies that basically pillage Africa of all its resources. And I don't care, because according to the Friedman principle, I can go and separate the one from the other. So this Friedman separation theorem is very important. And I think it's important to spell out. Friedman did it in a very tricky way in the article. After all, it was a popular article, but I want to try to write down under what assumption this is true, and then how realistic those assumptions are. So the first one is that, and here I think that Milton Friedman is very clear, at least on the first point, is companies should be operating in a competitive market. And you should read Friedman piece together with chapter 8 of his Capitalism and Freedom that was written in 1962, so 8 years earlier, in which is very clear that when you have a monopoly, then you should not maximize profit. So the 33% of the people who answered yes to the first question, they did not even pass Friedman 1962 test. Even Friedman would say otherwise. And here I added that companies should be not only price takers, but also rule takers, and I come back on that. The second is that either there are no externalities, or that the government is perfectly able to address those externalities. And I'll come back on that too. The third is that agents only care about monetary payoff. And the last one is contracts are complete. So we can write every complicated contract we can think of. Now, if those assumptions are true, that maximizing long-term shareholders' value lead to a Pareto optimal equilibrium. So in that sense, Friedman's separation theorem is right, to the extent that we like to be right in the classroom, that under certain assumption, the results follow. And now you might argue, and I'm sure that Markus agrees with that, is what is new here, because all well-trained economists recognize that I structure it in a way that resembles, in fact it is, a restatement of the celebrated first welfare theorem of economics. Under certain assumption, competitive equilibria are Pareto optimum. And I list down the assumption that ensure that that's the case, and that's kind of the world Friedman was operating in. Now you might say, then what's is new? Now, you have to put your historical hat and realize that the first welfare theorem, at least in the generality that we know as of today, was only proven in 1951. So 29 years before Friedman is writing that, and only 11 years before he writes Capitalism and Freedom. So was not completely sort of digested in the public sphere. So Friedman, remember, was not only a very clever economist, was also a great popularizer, a great diffuser of information. And so in that sense, he's pushing for the idea of economic theory to a large public like the one of the New York Times. But also, he makes a simpler argument. And so you can see in the back of his argument, especially in the 1962 book, that he has a welfare theorem in mind, but he makes a simpler argument that, of course, is better done in the New York Times, that the Arrow de Bray proof of the general equilibrium. And he said, basically, in a free economy, stakeholders voluntarily get together. So you have suppliers, you have customers, you have workers, you have provider of capital in the form of equity, in the form of debt. And in a free economy, they choose to get together. Nobody forces them. And in that decision, they assign the residual right to shareholders. So they decided, a group of them, and not every corporation, not every institution is like that, because you have non-profit institution where this is not the case. You have cooperative where this is not the case. But in the more standard form of corporation, what is decided is that shareholders get what is left after everybody is paid. And as a result, they have the right also to vote. And so Friedman argument that, of course, resonates tremendously with the American public. And this was one of the brilliant aspects of Friedman, to make arguments in a way that could resonate to ordinary people. He makes the argument that basically, if you impose additional burden to the corporation without letting shareholders vote, is a form of taxation without representation. And I think that I want you to keep in mind these two aspects, the welfare theorem, but also this taxation without representation, because they both have some validity here, and I will come back on them both.
So Luigi, can you elaborate a little bit why Friedman was so influential? Why could he push this and change the environment? He was not a policymaker, he was just an academic like we are.
It's true that he was an academic, but two things. Number one, was writing extremely well. And this is something that we underappreciate as academics, the quality of writing and the quality of making the argument. He was brilliant, both in writing and in debating. He was a formula debater. But two, I think he had a unique insight of seeing the weak point. This is a kind of Sun Tzu art of war, that you see the weak element of your enemy and you kind of put all their strength in that point. And so even in the war situation, and he loves, I should add the third thing, he loved to be provocative and challenge even the wildest crowd. So let me give you an example. In the middle of the 60s, with the anti-Vietnam War, etc., he goes in front of the University of Chicago students that were in a massive protest, okay? And, Friedman is not exactly a left-wing guy. And so facing a massive protester, very left-leaning, very angry, was not an easy thing to do. And in the middle of the debate, what he pulls out that is against the military draft. And he says that one of the elements of the freedom is that you choose to go to the army, you're not forced to go to the army. Surprise, surprise, he won the argument that day because nobody of those kids wanted to go to war. So I think he's very, very good, was very good at doing that. So now the question that we need to ask 50 years later is, to what extent these assumptions are true? And so I will go one by one, a little bit like I used to do when I was teaching the basic corporate finance class, of what the assumption of the Modigliani-Miller theorem, are they true, and to what extent should we pay attention? So the first one is, are contracts complete? Now, as a student and co-author of Oliver Hart, I cannot disagree with the fact that contracts are incomplete. And in fact, contracts are massively incomplete. So even if markets are perfectly competitive, they might not be perfectly competitive after people make some specific investment. So the best example in my way is with marriage. I'm going to get in trouble with this, but when you get to find a mate, the market is pretty competitive as it goes. When you decide to marry, and especially to have children, you make a very specific investment to your spouse. And ex post, you're in a situation of bilateral monopoly. Not complete, you have alternative outside, but they are extremely inferior to what is inside, because you have made a very, very specific investment, which is to have children. So after the specific investment are made, you have a situation of bilateral monopoly. And because contracts are incomplete, and marriage is a fantastic example of this, because it's the most incomplete of all the contracts. You don't write, even if you have a prenuptial agreement, you don't write who is going to take out the trash and who is going to do this and who is going to do that. You leave unspecified. And so ex post, there is a lot of bargaining going on. And so shareholders are not the only residual claimants. Think about employees. Employees might be seriously damaged if a company goes bankrupt, because they had a lot of career prospects that they lose out by it when the company goes bankrupt. We know that when a company goes bankrupt, the employees generally lose 30% of their wages in the next job. So that's a major loss. So shareholders are not the only residual claimant. So it comes naturally to say, wait a minute, why don't we want to protect also the employees? What about the community? When Caterpillar decided to move from Springfield, Illinois to Chicago, Springfield, Illinois real estate market collapsed because it was the only big company in town. So big externality on the community and so on and so forth. So it is natural to say, wait a minute, companies should protect other stakeholders from ex post opportunism. After all, Dodd's statement might not be a wrong one. Now, the major objection to this is, wait a minute, why stakeholders don't choose differently? In a sense, the vast majority of corporations, and as Markus said at the beginning, of course, we have non-for-profit. We actually both work for a non-for-profit, so we should be very much aware that this is an important sector. There are different organizational systems, but the vast, vast majority of corporations assign votes only to shareholders. And when you see a situation in which workers have votes, like in Germany, that's not the choice of the individual free parties, as being, as Markus said, mandated by law. So if companies choose that, they choose that for a reason. A recent court decision in a litigation between eBay and Newman. Newman is actually Craigslist. eBay invested in Craigslist, and Craig, or Craigslist of fame, was saying that Craigslist is there to provide an opportunity to everybody. And eBay sued, saying, wait a minute, it's not an opportunity for everybody, it's an opportunity to make profit because I invested in that. And the court said that having chosen a for-profit corporate form, then you should run the corporation for the benefits of your stockholders. The court said the Inc. after the company name, after all, has to mean at least that. So freedom of choice seems to suggest that, after all, this is the dominant choice. And if the dominant choice might be a dominant choice for a reason. Now, I'm old enough to know that not all evolutionary arguments are correct, and there are some flaws in it. And let me point out to three potential flaws. The first one, which we don't like very much in economics, but might be very important, is that not everybody has infinite rationality, and particularly many of the parties involved might have bounded rationality. Even without going to that, we know that there are parties with wealth constraints, so maybe workers will have bargained for a different situation, but they couldn't because of wealth constraint. The most sort of compelling might be that there are limits in the law. And it's true that before, for example, the creation of what is now called the benefit corporation, there might be some ambiguity. And then if you chose the corporate form, you had to basically have a fiduciary duty toward the shareholders, and that bounded you to that particular form. Now, in the last 10 years or so, most countries, including the United States, have a benefit corporation in which you're not bound to that fiduciary duty. A few companies choose the benefit corporation, but the overwhelming majority of companies, even when they start, they choose the traditional corporate form. So my inclination is, if you want to attack Friedman, this doesn't seem the strongest point of attack. I think that while it sounds very pleasant to say you should pay attention to all stakeholders, it seems that at the very minimum, freedom of choice seems to suggest that the first order consideration you have to pay attention to is the not overburdening the residual claimant. And so in that sense, Friedman was right on that front.
So Luigi, isn't it the case that, especially for startups, that a lot of the employees are also stock owners? They get a lot of stock options. And is this a way to get around it, that they just say, oh, we have this stock focus, but we just give them stock options and then align incentives between employees and shareholders?
It's a very interesting question, because this proves that they give to initial employees some bundle of cash flow rights and voting rights. But especially in startup, there is nothing that prevents them from unbundling this. They could have given them simply cash flow rights with no voting rights. They could have given them simply voting rights with no cash flow rights. So you could structure a startup by saying, we have the workers collectively decide at the majority of the votes. Nothing prevents people from doing that. If this was an efficient form, you wonder why nobody has invented it before, nobody has pioneered it before. So let's go to I go backward to assumption number 3. Individuals care only about monetary returns. Now, this is easy to dismiss. It's clearly false. Now, I'm giving here a lecture for free. Markus is there for free. And in particularly Markus, who is very clever, could make much more money by being in Wall Street than by being in Princeton. So he chooses to be in Princeton because he cares about things other than money. It's not that he doesn't care about money, but he cares things about other than money. So I think that that's a very simple thing. And the fact that people give donations, the fact that we have endowments, and it's hard to say that the Bill Gates Foundation should only care about money, because that's not a statement of the Bill Gates Foundation. So the fact that individuals care only about money is blatantly false. So false that actually Friedman anticipated the objection and said, no, don't worry. Because even if shareholders are really socially minded and they want to donate to their corporate charity, it is much better to let the companies maximize shareholders' value and distribute the profits, and then each individual will donate the profit they receive to their preferred cause. That separation that I argued before is absolutely true in the example that Friedman chooses. But if you pay attention, Friedman chooses a knife-edge example, an example in which, if you keep away taxes, there are no efficiency consideration of whether donations should be done at the corporate level or the individual level. So it's equally efficient to donate at the individual level as it is at the corporate level, but is better to donate at the individual level because Markus and I might disagree on which is our favorite charity. So let's have our common company maximize profits, distribute the money, and then we choose how to allocate the money. This result is absolutely true in as far as corporate donations are concerned. Is probably not true for most of the other sort of corporate social activity. And this is where my paper with Oliver Hart in 2017 comes handy, because what we show is that under the reasonable assumption that, for example, it is cheaper not to pollute than they pollute and clean up, then it is more efficient for companies to adopt the shareholder social objective, like protecting the environment. Now, I'm not saying that everybody wants to protect the environment. I don't even know exactly, and I'll come to that in a second, how to aggregate the social objective, but it's not a guaranteed conclusion that is optimal for companies to maximize profits and then distribute. The example I made it before, the Gates Foundation, I need to double check in which company they invest, but imagine they invest in oil companies. The Gates Foundation invests in oil companies that they bribe and pillage in Africa in order to get extraction rights. Then they take the money, they give it to the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation distribute the money in order to undo the disaster they've done in Africa. That is not socially optimal by any stretch of the imagination. And that's a simple point that Oliver and I make in that paper. Now, what does it imply here? It implies that corporate boards should maximize not shareholder value, but shareholder welfare. Now, what is shareholder welfare? That's a bit of an open debate, because, of course, this brings very complicated social choice issues into the corporation. And then there are a lot of people, starting from Gene Farmer to end with John Matsusaka, who wrote on pro-market. Both of them wrote on pro-market on this issue. They say that the benefit is not worth the cost, that the governance cost of figuring out what shareholders want is larger than the benefit of having companies avoid bribing in Africa. I disagree, but that's kind of a subjective thing and a cost-benefit analysis, and it's for another day. But you can see here two very legitimate positions on this front.
So Luigi,
Yeah.
can I just interject here? If there is a contract possibility of, let's say, a pollution right between polluting in this particular village, it could be that the shareholder himself, he collects the money and then buys a pollution right, like a Coase theorem approach, to get rid of this problem. No? So it's the incomplete contract is, so if you grant Friedman that he understood the incomplete contract, if you give him incomplete contracts, if there were complete contracts, then the problem would not be there. Is this correct? Or?
I think that if you take the extreme Coasian view, which, by the way, Ronald Coase did not hold, that every thing could be fixed by having well-defined property rights because transaction costs are zero, then you're absolutely right. Now, in real life, we know transaction costs are not zero, and so I think that that's even trying to be generous with Friedman and say that he brought Coase into the picture here. I don't think that that's a tenable position, at least from a practical point of view. You can defend yourself in the ivory tower and say we assume zero transaction costs, but you can also assume the famous steam opener and starve in the between. Okay, so speaking of, this is perfect, the externality. We know that there are large externality. Now, one point that is often forgotten, and I think is very important, in the 50s and 60s, shareholders tended to be very locally based. So most of the shareholders of Caterpillar were located in southern Illinois. And that made it extremely easy to internalize these externalities. With the diffusion of with the internationalization, but also with the diffusion of portfolio theory and the impact that finance had on portfolio allocation, people start to invest in indices. And so that makes it much more difficult to fix this problem. And so you need to have legislation trying to make it to fix. And now what is interesting is conservatives like Steve Kaplan, who wrote on pro-market, say you shouldn't care about externality as a company. Why? Because regulation will take care of it. And in a sense, he's right if you think that, number one, regulation is perfect, and number two, companies play no role in interfering with regulation. Unfortunately, that's not true. First of all, it's funny that these are the very same people that argue against regulation. So when it comes to regulation, they're against regulation. When it comes to companies being involved, they say, oh, but regulation will fix it. But the next day they lobby against regulation. So that's a bit of a contradiction. But besides that, I think that it would be much easier for governments to regulate if companies did not lobby massively against regulation. A point I will return because it's very, very important. Now, can this externality be resolved by the private sector through votes? Markus mentioned a recent paper Elena Boccardo, Oliver Hart, and I wrote. The paper is much broader than that, but there is one interesting result that I want to stress because it's very important. And he says that if the majority of investors are even slightly altruistic, so we're not saying that everybody is altruistic, but we say that at least 50.1% of the people care a teeny tiny bit about something other than just their own well-being. And shareholders are asked to vote on, for example, pollution decision. Then diversified shareholders will vote as a central planner would, so they internalize the externality, they do the right thing. And the logic of the argument is very, very simple, is that if you are very well diversified, the impact of the direct impact of the cost of this decision on your portfolio is trivial, but you have a first order impact on the externality itself. So if you care about this, you're going to vote in the right way. Now, before you think that all the problems are resolved, Unfortunately, the Department of Labor today is trying to make its best to prevent asset managers to do exactly this. There is a new directive chosen by Eugene Scalia, some coincidence of the more famous Antonin Scalia, that suggests mandates asset managers not to consider anything else except financial returns in their decision. So if I represent the pensioner in a town, and I know that that town will be destroyed by pollution by that firm, I should still maximize the financial return of my investors, ignoring the fact that the pensioners will die because of pollution. So what I see, however, is the fact that somebody not so in favor of regulation, like President Trump or even Eugene Scalia himself, are resorting to regulation to prohibit this, suggests that this is actually potentially a very effective method. And that's the reason why they need to resort to the power of the government to stop it. Now, let's go to the easy stuff. Assumption number 1A, are companies price takers? This is, Friedman is completely clear, is very much agrees that monopolies should not maximize profits. Now, he believed that monopolies did not exist without any government protection, but faced with Google today, I would like to imagine that he thinks about Google as a monopoly, because that's what it is. And monopoly, by the way, achieved through organic growth and superior performance. So a monopoly that does not violate the antitrust rules, at least in when you search engine, they might have done other stuff, but in the search engine, they achieve this monopoly following the rules. Are we prepared to say that they should not have any social responsibility? No. My answer is no. Now, how do you prevent that from happening? There are 3 ways. 2 are not very appealing. One is nationalization, and I don't think we want the Google search run like the post office. Number 2, regulation. By running the Stigler Center, I fear that a regulatory agency of Google might actually represent the interest of Google and not the interest of the people. Then there is a third alternative that I would like to explore later, because it's useful also in the context of rule takers. Now, what I consider the biggest hole in Friedman's argument is the fact that he assumes that companies are rule takers. In fact, in a very 1970 article, he said corporations should make as much money as possible while conforming to their basic rule of society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. And in a separate piece, he repeats the first part: you should maximize profits as long as you play by the rules of the game, which is fair competition and blah, blah, blah. So here he seems to suggest that companies should take rules and not make them. But his colleague at Chicago, Joe Stigler, the year after he wrote the 1970 pieces, wrote the famous piece about regulatory capture, in which he recognized that corporations actually capture the regulators and shade regulation. And the irony is that the two never met. Of course, they met in the corridor every day, but they never conflated these two views. And now, if you realize that rules are not exogenous, they are endogenous, then are you prepared to say that the social responsibility of CEO is to lobby Congress to be free of any polluting law and pollute as much as possible? Are we saying that the CEO should maximize profits at the cost of bribing congressmen if bribes are legal? You know, in the old days in Germany, bribing foreign officials was legal. And so was a duty of a CEO to bribe foreign officials to get more business? I am not prepared to say that. I don't know who will. And I think that this is where the Friedman rules are untenable. And now the bigger question, and the one that I don't think we have a fully comprehensive answer, is how we are going to constrain companies on this front. Now, let me give you a glimpse of hope. As I told you, basically, we own most of corporate America. Three asset management firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, and Fidelity, together own this amount of stock on the largest corporation. So pick Microsoft, roughly 20% is owned by these three guys. If these three guys vote collectively, they probably have the majority because only a fraction of the shareholders vote. So you can easily run Microsoft if you control those three companies. Now, this has potentially very dangerous effect from a competition argument. However, as a very powerful message that is these guys vote in the right way, we can change the world. And the good news is we're pretty close to change the world. This is from the Morningstar proxy voting database, and this is the amount of support that on average shareholder proposition forcing companies to disclose their lobbying are receiving at shareholders meeting. We are at 31%. 10 years ago, we were at 14%. We are within striking distance of making a difference. And I think we can make a difference. The problem is that the evil powers are fighting back and they're using the Department of Labor to protect them. Now, what can we say about, from an economic point of view, the evaluation of Friedman doctrine today?
Luigi, can I just ask something about, is it good that you have such a concentration of power of three players?
Of course it's not. Of course it's not. However, the redeeming feature and a feature that I personally would like to exploit is to say we should make those guys accountable. So Larry Fink writes a letter to all the CEO of corporate America every year. I want to write a letter to Larry Fink and say, I want to hold you accountable for how you vote your shares. And once I debated Larry Fink at a meeting and he said, oh, the Department of Labor is forcing us to do that. And I said, Larry, the Department of Labor is forcing you to do nothing because with $8 trillion under management, if you want a rule of the Department of Labor be changed, you change it yesterday, not tomorrow. Okay, so I think that we need to realize this. We need to make these people accountable, and through that accountability, change the system in the right direction. So I think that maybe this is true for every statement, but Friedman doctrine is more valid than its detractors claim, but more wrong than its supporters would like. So I think that there is no theoretical reason, and I'm biased here, but there is no theoretical reason to insist on shareholders' value maximization rather than shareholders' welfare maximization. I think that that, in my view, is a no-brainer. Now, this change might be enough for externality. I think is unlikely to be enough in the presence of monopoly power, like Google, or in the presence of lobbying power. Now, I would like to divide the world into two and say, if you are a small corporation, and when I say small, I don't mean the grocery around the corner. My favorite example was Chuck E. Cheese. Unfortunately, Chuck E. Cheese went bankrupt recently, so I have to pick a better example. But, you know, a corporation that is listed on the stock market, but is not a large in the sense that we intend today. Chuck E. Cheese has no market power. It's heavily subjected to regulation because if I step down from the board of the EPA or from the board of OSHA, from the board, I don't go to the board of Chuck E. Cheese. I might go to the board of DuPont. I might do the board of Merck. I don't go to the board of Chuck E. Cheese. And really, they have no lobbying power. And this is, have you ever heard about a member of parliament representing Chuck E. Cheese? No. So I think that Friedman principle, modulo the variation and Oliver introduced, I think Friedman principle applies to Chuck E. Cheese. Very different if you are a very large corporation. Not only Google, it is clear monopoly, but think about Dow Chemical. Think about Merck. Think about companies that, for what matters, actually BlackRock, okay? These companies are so large that, number one, are likely to enjoy some market power. But even if they don't enjoy market power, they are certainly Number one, too big to fail, and number two, too big to jail. And also, they can easily change the rules of the game. For these companies, the idea of applying the Friedman principle, in my view, is completely wrong. Now, what is the alternative? First of all, how do you define large? This is a bit tricky. However, Markus teaches me that the Dodd-Frank Act has been able to create some systemically important financial institutions that are treated differently, and in part is based on their size and their systemic importance. So I don't think it's out of the question. But here is where
Luigi, can ask you, but
you
want a 1-0 or 0-1 definition, not a continuum. So it's either you're small or large. There's nothing.
Yeah, and I come to that why I want a 0-1. I think that's an excellent point. But so this is I want to tell you, this is number one, tentative, is work in progress, Oliver Hart, and we'll not work out all the details. But I want to give you a bit of a gist of where my thinking is going that direction. And my thinking is to say, I think it's reasonable for companies like BlackRock, for a company like Google, to introduce a fiduciary duty to our society. What does it mean, a fiduciary duty to our society? The board members are personally responsible if the company opportunistically exploits some externality. So if I'm on the board of DuPont, and I use DuPont now as being bought by Dow Chemical and has merged and so on and so forth, but I wrote an article looking at one particular case of pollution DuPont, in which I don't know if the ultimate board, but somebody inside DuPont did a cost-benefit analysis, seeing that actually the benefit of polluting the Ohio River with the PFOAs, which are this toxic substance, was worth it. And so for 25 years, they dumped the PFOAs in the Ohio River, killing hundreds of people, and basically pay no cost. Because the CEO of DuPont died, and the obituary in the Wall Street Journal was the environmental leader. So this guy who chose to dump PFOA in the Ohio River is an environmental master that is celebrated at his death. So I want to say, if you're on the board of that company, you should do a cost-benefit analysis of what it costs to pollute. And I'm not a bleeding heart liberal to say that the optimal amount of pollution is zero. There is a cost and the benefit of pollution. But I want you to at least look at the societal cost of pollution. And if the societal cost way exceed the societal benefit, even if this is profitable, you have a personal responsibility of not doing it. Okay?
But the small company will still do it?
The small company will do it. Why? Because I trust the EPA to go after the small companies. DuPont hired the former chairman of the EPA on the board. They drafted the environmental rule that apply to PFOA. Those big companies, they have too much power. Those are the ones who should be penalized. In a sense, this is nothing else that Dodd-Frank applied to every other company. Like if you are systemically important, you have to be treated differently. If you are systemically important from the point of view of power, you have to be treated differently. And that's kind of the message.
Okay.
Now, I need to terminate, but I want a political evaluation of the Friedman Doctrine. Friedman piece, as we say, came at the right time, when competition from Europe and Japan and inflation were forcing companies to change. One of the things that is unthinkable today, but one of the things in the back of the mind of Friedman when he writes, is the Johnson administration were calling CEOs to keep prices low, to keep inflation low. And the Johnson administration was using social responsibility as a justification for this pressure. On this aspect, Friedman brought a very fresh, a very novel, a very right idea to the table and moved companies in the right direction. Now, what I think is we went too far, and it's now time to have a new reevaluation of this, not throwing away everything that was done, but building on what Friedman has done to build a better world. Now, concluding, I think that the problem we're facing today is the US capitalist system is not delivering for the majority of Americans, and this leads to the desire for change. And we are in a world of third best, so it's very hard to evaluate how to best change. Many requests of change are purely opportunistic, others are just pretense, but I don't want to forget that the need is real. And let me end by saying, if you want to learn more from me, I have a podcast with Bethany McLean called Capital Isn't, what is working about capitalism today, and most importantly, what isn't.
Thanks a lot, Luigi. That was fascinating. So we got a very fresh perspective to overturn Milton Friedman for large companies. Some questions came up, and I would like to throw these questions at you. In particular, what about if a certain company is mostly owned by people who don't care about the environment? Is it then okay to pollute? So let's suppose there's a big company, all its shareholders are all, environmentally ignorant, they don't care about it. How would you handle that? Are they still representing the welfare of the shareholders because they don't have the same preference? Or more generally, how to aggregate the preferences across shareholders? That's okay. The second question.
Excellent question, and thanks for the question, because hopefully it gives me an opportunity to clarify my position. In no way I'm saying we don't need regulation, okay? In no way I'm saying that. So I always thought that maximization of shareholder welfare is useful to complement the failure of regulation. I don't believe that regulation is perfect. I would like to know the person who does, but I think on the margin, we can do more. And one aspect that I think people don't fully appreciate is that corporations are today now worse than the average of us. Why? Because we tied them in a system in which they are all forced to look only at one aspect. So I'm the last one to celebrate the golden days of the past, but in the past, when you had shareholders that were more actively involved, they care more about the SNI than today. In Italy, small companies care about the employees more than the large companies. Why? Because the owner actually lives with the employees. They live more with the employees than with his spouse because they work all the time. And so there is a bonding, there is an internalization of the benefits that is forgotten today. So I'm not saying that we should replace regulation with maximization of shareholders' welfare. I'm saying that we should temper the extreme in which we are in today by allowing shareholders to pick and choose. And of course there would be sorting, and of course there would be companies that are only owned by the Koch brothers, and they're going to pollute the hell of it. That's the reason why I actually started a research project with Eleanor and Oliver to understand to what extent divestment works. And the answer is not very much, precisely for that reason, because if I simply divest and I make it more attractive for the Koch brothers to buy the company. And so there's no guarantee that the outcome is better. It might actually get worse. And in the process, I enrich the Koch brothers. So I'm going exactly in the opposite direction. So I'm not in any way saying that fixes all the problems. Is a small step in the right direction. And the reason why we are elaborating this societal fiduciary duty is exactly to address this. And let me clarify, because other people have come in, starting with Elizabeth Warren, and more recently Leo Strine and Colin Mayer have brought some ideas of creating a corporate purpose or societal purpose to companies. I see this as very dangerous when this is applied to everybody, and when you have a government decides what is a social purpose, what is not a social purpose. Because even Markus and I think we agree on most things. You probably disagree on some things of what is something is a good purpose, not purpose. And we both come from countries that have faced terrible dictatorship, and so we realize that sometimes what is sold as good for society is actually terrible. In a sense, the savings and loans of Italy at the time were non-for-profits. were distributing their profits to the fascist organization during the fascist period. And that was considered a corporate purpose. So I see very dangerous path to have the state decide what is a legitimate purpose for a company. On the other hand, I do think that when you reach the size of BlackRock, you do have to have a responsibility to society.
So how would you implement that? In particular, would there be an incentive for firms to delist and in order to control who the shareholders are? So once you're listed, you can't really control who your average shareholder is. But
if the issue is about there will be a tendency to buy out and become private, like the Koch brothers are, and run privately, absolutely. That's the reason why the diversity element is not sufficient to fix the problem. On the point of the societal responsibility, absolutely not. In fact, you asked earlier, and I forgot to answer, on the 0-1, I do want a 0-1, exactly like the systemically important financial institution, the SIFI. And the reason why is because I give you the possibility of ratchet down your size and get rid of it. And it says, do you really think that's a cost if you are Facebook? Spun off WhatsApp and Instagram tomorrow, have 3 independent companies, and all of a sudden you are free from that constraint. So I see that as a very handy tool to enforce another thing that is dear to me, more fragmentation in the US economy.
So you mentioned one big impact in your thinking was also the assumption, or in reality, we have bounded rationality. You know? The beauty of the Milton-Friedman argument is that it's very clean, clear mandate, while the others are less clean. Do you think that's a problem?
You prefer to be clearly wrong than vaguely right? I think that some people say often wrong but never in doubt. No, most seriously, I think that it is a beauty of the mandate of Friedman, and that's one of the reasons why it's been so successful. I think that in practice, there are a lot of institutions that have multiple mandates. We both work in one. At one point, I served in a search committee for dean of my business school, and I realized how difficult the job of a dean is. It's much more difficult than the job of any CEO because you have multiple constituencies. And you have one particularly vocal, which is us, you cannot even fire. So imagine how bad that is. So you have multiple constituencies. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily universities are run perfectly, far from me saying that, but I'm saying it is possible. And it's challenging, but it's possible. And I think that argument has been a bit overplayed. So we need to be mindful. There is a danger of complete lack of accountability. And I am the first one to object to the Business Roundtable decision or statement, because the Business Roundtable statement sounds very much like we do whatever we want and nobody can ask us to be accountable because it's so vague. And what I love of the piece that Lucian Babchuk wrote recently is that he went on and looked at how they behave, the companies that signed the Business Roundtable. They behave in the most selfish way possible. They are the first one to fire people during COVID. So all that stuff is complete propaganda to basically give them the flexibility of do whatever they want and not be accountable. So I see that as a serious danger. I think we should fight against that, but having the wrong objective just for being clear, it seems like too much to take.
So there's another question I would like to throw at you from the audience. If you look at income and wealth inequality, should this also be one consideration? Because it's really a money issue, like what is in Friedman as well. Do you want to have this social inequality in terms of wealth or income? Do you want to incorporate this in welfare share, or is this separate?
So that's a very, very good question. Now, I think that when it comes to the money administered by the corporation, there is a very easy way to fix that inequality is you donate that money. And in a sense, Bill Gates, in a sense, has done that. Now, he has chosen to donate to people in Africa, now to the poor in Seattle, but that's a different story. But he clearly went in that direction. So I think that I don't see necessarily corporations engage into this business of reducing inequality. However, I do think that monopoly is the source of a lot of inequalities, and so fighting monopolies and some of what I say go in the direction of fighting monopolies is something that has very important redistributive properties. My favorite example is who used to be the richest man on earth, Carlos Slim, went from 60 billion to 30 billion in a year. Now he's still very rich, but half as rich. Why? Because you brought competition in the cell phone market in Mexico. So basically, you had a massive redistribution because the cost of making phone calls in Mexico plummeted. So you had really a massive redistribution to the Mexican population at the expense of one rich guy. So inequality in Mexico went down significantly as a result of just one form of the regulation. And I think you can go a long way in that direction with more competition.
So your colleague Gene Farmer would like to know, how to get this aggregate, a meaningful aggregate welfare function across the shareholders. Do you have any thoughts how you would do it? Because that's a key question, essentially.
It is a key question. I think that at the end of the day, the best is the enemy of the good. Even if we have the Arrow's impossibility theorem and all the stuff, I think that getting people say what they like is not a terrible way to decide. And especially in a system where you actually pay, your vote is proportional to how much you pay the cost, because the vote is by shares, it's not by people. So I think that if you have some guidelines on what is the trade-off, because the thing I cannot stand is most corporate managers say it's a win-win situation. And as economists, I think there are always trade-offs, and I say, how much are we willing to pay for that trade-off? So I give you a very concrete example where this can be voted tomorrow. So oil companies burn a lot of gas through flaring. Flaring is emission of methane gas that comes with the oil extraction and is generally too costly to be captured. So either they release it directly, which is terrible for global warming, or they burn and it's still bad for global warming and produce no good. Okay, so it's, from a societal point of view, is a gigantic waste. And if you think that's small, no, it's roughly 3 or 4% of all CO2 produced in the United States is produced in this way. Now, why they produce it? Because the alternative is more expensive. If I were to capture gas, will cost me money. So should I decide to lose some money and capture the gas or not? And the question is, at the end of the day, a question that shareholders who pay the price, in this Milton Friedman was right, they pay the price, they have the right to decide, and they say, I'm willing to get 2 cents less on my dividend in exchange for a 3% reduction of CO2. Or I'm not willing to do it. I don't know why this vote is so difficult to do it. Very concrete, and let's have it. Let's try it.
But there are a lot of detailed decisions, and the average shareholder doesn't have the expertise to make judgment on that. So how would you delegate this decision-making, the voting power, to some experts? Or you outsource your votes to somebody who is environmentally friendly? There's some agency who takes over for you, or how do you envision that?
So let me do a little bit of a promotion for not myself, but another great scholar who is John Matsusaka, who just wrote a book, Let People Rule. Is a book about referendum, and he overturns, in my view, the preconception that referenda only work in Switzerland because in Switzerland they're different. Okay, he uses data about the United States, data about California, showing that actually people are pretty smart in major decision in referenda. Okay, and your argument, they don't know enough, is a very dangerous argument because, and I'm not saying that you are going there, but go to the direction, let the knowledgeable people rule the country. You go to a technocracy or epistocracy, how you want to call it, that is pretty dangerous. So I do believe, and it's not just a religious belief, it's a belief based on the facts, and John Matsusaka in the book provides these facts that shows that actually people do pay attention to facts. And even if they don't do all the digging, they get some information that is probably best than most the information that our congressmen get. When the Obama plan was passed, Nancy Pelosi said, let's vote on it, so we're going to figure out what is in it. Because nobody in Congress knew what they were voting on, okay? So the idea that delegation brings competence is not true. What delegation brings very effectively is compromise, is making trade-offs, and what individual voting makes impossible the log rolling that you have. And now you can argue sometimes log rolling is useful for democracy, but that can be too much of a good thing. So I think a little bit more referendum is good for the political system. A little bit more of asking shareholders is good. Now, additional advantage vis-a-vis the democracy is we have intermediaries, financial intermediaries. So I can start a green S&P 500 fund, okay? And I give the same return as Vanguard because I invest in the S&P as well, but I only vote in favor of X, Y, and Z. And so you, Marcus, you don't need to know the detail of the proposal on DuPont. You just trust my fund, or don't trust my fund, depending on your preference, invest in me, and I do the due diligence, I vote, and I accomplish what you like. So I don't think it's that impossible.
So let's come, one final question about that. So you would prefer such an arrangement over ESG funds, where you can't invest in all of the 500 companies, you can only invest in 300 which are more environmentally clean. How is the difference to that? And then I want to throw the last question at you, relating to Milton Friedman. You always said Milton Friedman knew which button to press in order to make social change. Have you found your button on this agenda? And what is it?
Okay, those are all very tricky questions. Let me start with the easy one first. So I don't think ESG funds will do the job for two reasons. One, the one you already pointed out, that is very profitable for companies to actually choose an alternative strategy and get funding from somewhere else. Yes, if ESG funds are large enough, I think they might make a difference, but I'm not so sure. And two, I am very skeptical about rating systems. We know that credit rating did not perform particularly well during the crisis, but they had 100 years of reputation. By the way, reputation accumulated in a period where there was a subscription-based model and not an issuer-paid model. In the ESG world, I think that I'm very skeptical of the ESG firms, and I've seen firms that I know as a fact they're not environmental friendly, getting very high ESG ratings. And the literature shows that the correlation between the ESG rating is close to zero. So I think that's just marketing by and large, and I don't think that this is going to make a big difference, except make rich a few good marketing guys. On my button, I think that this is on my button: change corporate America one vote at a time.
Thanks a lot, Luigi. Fantastic presentation. We stay in touch, and thanks again. I hope to see you soon in the real world again.
My pleasure. I look forward to the real world.
Okay, bye-bye.